The night was cold, and the rain poured down like a never-ending curtain, blurring the streetlights and drenching everything in sight. A girl, no older than 17, shivered as she stood outside a stranger's house. Her hoodie was soaked, clinging to her small frame, her arms wrapped tightly around her belly, the belly that carried a life inside. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling as she reached for the doorbell. She had nowhere else to go. Inside, Mark was just settling in for the night. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at this hour. He lived alone, enjoying the quiet, the predictability of his life. But when the sound of the doorbell rang through his house, something in his gut told him this wasn't an ordinary visitor. He opened the door, and there she was, soaked, exhausted, and clearly terrified. Her eyes were filled with a silent plea, a desperation that made him pause. "Please," he said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Mark didn't know what to say. He wasn't the kind of person who usually got involved in other people's problems. He liked his space, his routines. But something about the way she stood there, clutching her belly, made him take a deep breath and step aside. "Come in," he finally said. The girl hesitated before stepping into the warm house, her body still shivering from the cold. Mark grabbed a towel and handed it to her, watching as she wiped the rain from her face. She looked so young, so lost. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she said, barely meeting his eyes. Mark nodded. "You want some tea or something? You're shaking." Emma nodded, her hands still trembling as she hugged herself. Mark walked to the kitchen, his mind racing. Who was this girl? Why was she out alone in the middle of the night? And most importantly, why did she come to his house? As the kettle boiled, Emma sat on the couch, glancing around nervously. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the storm outside, but she couldn't shake the fear gripping her chest. She had taken a huge risk knocking on a stranger's door, but she had no other choice. Mark returned with a steaming mug and set it in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. He sat across from her, waiting for her to speak, but she didn't. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. "You want to tell me why you're out in the rain by yourself?" he finally asked. Emma's grip tightened around the mug. She wasn't sure how much she should say. Would he throw her out if he knew the truth? Would he call someone? She had been running for what felt like forever, and she was so tired. Mark noticed her hesitation. "Look, I'm not gonna force you to talk," he said. "But if you're in trouble, maybe I can help." Emma looked at him then, really looked at him. He seemed kind, but she had trusted the wrong people before. She had been let down more times than she could count. But something about his eyes, the way he wasn't pressuring her, made her want to believe him. I needed somewhere safe," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just for tonight." Mark nodded slowly. He didn't press for details. "All right," he said. "You can stay here tonight. But tomorrow, we need to figure out a plan." Emma exhaled, relief washing over her. She had a place to sleep, even if just for one night. That was more than she had yesterday. But neither of them knew that this night would change both of their lives forever. Because sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to something far greater than either person could ever imagine. Emma sat curled up on the couch, holding the warm mug in her hands, but she still felt cold on the inside. She had spent so many nights feeling like this, lost, afraid, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't sleeping in a bus station or behind a locked bathroom door, hoping no one would find her. She was inside someone's home. Someone who didn't know her, didn't owe her anything, yet had still let her in. Mark sat in the armchair across from her, watching her carefully. She barely made eye contact, her fingers gripping the mug as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. He wanted to ask her more, where she was from, who she was running from, but he knew better than to push. She would talk when she was ready. After a long silence, Emma finally spoke. "I was living with my mom," she said quietly, staring at the steam rising from her tea. "But when she found out I was pregnant, she kicked me out." Mark wasn't sure what to say. He had seen tough situations before, but he couldn't imagine throwing out his own child like that. "I'm sorry," he said, because he didn't know what else to say. Emma shrugged, her expression guarded. "It's not like we were close anyway." She was always more focused on herself. When she got a new boyfriend, I guess I just didn't fit into her plans anymore. Mark's jaw tightened. He hated people who abandoned their own, especially when they needed help the most. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. Emma hesitated, then sighed. "A few months." That hit Mark hard. A pregnant teenager out on the streets with no one looking out for her. How had she even made it this far? "Where's the baby's father?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. Emma let out a bitter laugh. "Gone. Disappeared the moment he found out. Blocked my number, stopped showing up to school, like I never even existed." She shook her head. "I guess I should have seen it coming." Mark exhaled slowly. He had always believed people showed their true colors when things got hard. And this kid, the one who left Emma alone to fend for herself, had clearly been the wrong kind of person. Emma took a deep breath, as if saying everything out loud had taken all her energy. I just wanted somewhere safe, even if just for a little while." Mark looked at her, at the exhaustion written all over her face. He had been planning on giving her a place to rest for the night, and then figuring something out in the morning. But now, seeing the weight she carried, he wasn't sure he could just send her back into the world with nothing. "You can stay here," he said before he even realized he was saying it. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What?" "You don't have anywhere else to go," he said. "You can stay here. At least until we figure something out." Emma blinked as if she couldn't quite process his words. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice shaking. Mark shrugged. "I know enough, and I know you shouldn't be out there alone." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, as if she was too used to hiding her emotions. "Thank you," she whispered. Mark nodded, feeling something shift inside him. He had always kept to himself, never letting anyone get too close. But something about this girl, this scared, stubborn, strong girl, made him realize that sometimes life throws people into your path for a reason. The next few days were strange. Mark wasn't used to having someone else in the house. Emma kept to herself, staying in the guest room most of the time. She was polite but distant, as if she was afraid of overstaying her welcome. Mark didn't push her, but he made sure she ate, made sure she was comfortable. But then one night, everything changed. Mark was in the kitchen when he heard Emma crying. It was muffled, like she was trying to keep it quiet, but it was enough to make him pause. He hesitated, wondering if he should leave her alone, but something told him to check on her. He knocked on her door. "Emma?" No response, just more quiet sobs. He pushed the door open slowly and found her sitting on the bed, hugging her stomach, tears streaming down her face. "Hey," he said gently, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know if I can be a mom. I don't even know how to take care of myself." Mark sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "No one's ever really ready," he said after a moment. "But you're stronger than you think." Emma let out a shaky breath. "What if I mess up?" What if I can't protect my baby? What if I become like my mom? Mark felt a familiar ache in his chest. You won't, he said firmly. You're already fighting for your baby. That's more than she ever did for you. Emma wiped her face, sniffling. I'm just so scared. Mark nodded. It's okay to be scared. But you're not alone anymore. Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since she arrived, he saw something new in her eyes. Hope. But just as things started to feel safe, reality came crashing back in. One afternoon, while Emma was in the kitchen, there was a knock at the door. Mark opened it, expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor. Instead, he found a woman standing there. Emma's mother. She looked past Mark and spotted Emma, her eyes narrowing. So this is where you've been hiding. Emma froze, her hands gripping the counter. What are you doing here? Her mother scoffed. What am I doing here? You disappeared. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me? Mark stepped in front of Emma protectively. She's safe here, he said, his voice firm. Her mother crossed her arms, her expression hard. She's my daughter. She belongs with me. Emma's hands were shaking. You threw me out, she said, her voice breaking. You didn't care where I went. Her mother's expression didn't soften. Well, I've changed my mind. Mark could feel the tension in the room thickening. Something about this woman didn't sit right with him. Emma shook her head. No, I'm not going back. Her mother's eyes flashed with anger. You don't have a choice. Mark clenched his fists, feeling the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just some family dispute. This was a moment that could change everything. And as Emma stood there, staring at the woman who had abandoned her, she realized something. She wasn't the same scared girl who had been thrown out months ago. She had found a strength inside her that she never knew existed. But what she didn't know was that her mother had one final move to make. And it would change everything. Emma's breath felt stuck in her throat. Her mother's presence in Mark's house was like a dark cloud rolling in, threatening to take away the tiny piece of safety she had finally found. She had expected a lot of things, anger, maybe even regret, but not this. Not her mother suddenly deciding she wanted her back. Mark stood firm beside her, his presence grounding, but Emma knew this was her fight. She had spent too long running, too long fearing the past. She wasn't the same helpless girl anymore. You don't get to do this, Emma said, her voice stronger than she expected. Her mother let out a scoff, shaking her head. I don't get to do what? Try to take responsibility for my daughter. Emma's hands curled into fists. Now you want to be a mother. After you threw me out like garbage. Her mother's expression flickered with something, guilt, maybe, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. I was upset. I didn't mean to push you away, but you just disappeared. Do you have any idea how that made me look? And there it was. It wasn't about Emma. It was about her image. You didn't even try to find me, Emma said, her voice shaking. You never called. You never cared. Until now. Her mother shifted on her feet, crossing her arms. I did look for you. And then I found out you were living here, with some man you don't even know. She threw a sharp look at Mark. What kind of grown man takes in a pregnant teenage girl? Mark didn't flinch, but Emma could feel the tension in his body. She knew what her mother was implying. You don't get to twist this, Emma snapped. Mark was the only person who helped me. When you left me with nothing. When everyone else turned their backs. Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples. Look, I didn't come here to fight. I came here to bring you home. Emma shook her head. Home? Where? To a place where I'm not wanted. Where I'll be reminded every day that I ruined your life. Her mother's face hardened. It's not safe for you to be out here alone. Emma exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. I'm not alone. Mark finally spoke, his voice steady. She's not going anywhere unless she wants to. Her mother turned to him, eyes sharp. You don't get to make that decision. Mark met her gaze without hesitation. No, but Emma does. A long silence stretched between them. Emma took a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment she had to decide, keep running or stand her ground. I'm not going with you, she said. Her mother's face darkened. You don't understand what you're doing, Emma. You're still a kid. No, Emma said firmly. I'm not. I stopped being a kid the moment you gave up on me. Her mother's jaw tightened. For the first time, Emma saw it, realization, that she had lost this fight, that Emma wasn't bending to her control anymore. Her mother exhaled, shaking her head. Fine, she said coldly. Do whatever you want. She turned, heading toward the door, but before she left, she looked back one last time. But don't come running back when you realize how hard this is. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat as the door shut behind her mother. She expected to feel relief, but instead there was just emptiness. Not because she wanted her mother back, but because she had always dreamed, deep down, that maybe things could be different. That maybe one day her mother would actually choose her. Mark didn't say anything for a while. He just let her process. You okay? He finally asked. Emma let out a shaky breath, nodding. Yeah. And for the first time, she really meant it. The days that followed were different. Later, Emma still had moments of doubt, but she no longer felt like she was waiting for something, waiting to be rescued, waiting for an apology that would never come. She had made her choice, and that choice was to move forward. Mark helped her find a small place of her own, not far from his. It wasn't much, but it was hers. He helped her set it up, making sure she had everything she needed. And when the day finally came, when she held her newborn baby in her arms for the first time, she knew she had done the right thing. She wasn't alone. She had built something new, a future that wasn't defined by the past. And as she looked down at her baby, she made a silent promise. She would never let her child feel unwanted. She would be the mother she never had. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid anymore.